right, welcome back, everybody. So this is part four. This will be our last session going through this anthropic research on the biology of a language model. And the last couple sessions, we did a quick recap for anybody that's new. So I'm going to do it another recap, but even faster. So for those who want more of the details, you should take a look at parts 1, 2, and 3. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? So this is work we're looking at from Anthropic. The distilled circuits thread started in 2020, and then we've had a number of papers here that they've posted on the web, looking at the role of attention in LLMs, and then really trying to understand what's going on with the information in the hidden representations inside the LLM. And what we've discovered is that there's more concepts than there are dimensions in the LLM, and this is causing the LLM to do things akin to compressed sensing, where we have polysemantic features and they're being encoded whenever there's sufficient sparsity between concepts so that they don't end up colliding in the same sentence or paragraph or something like that. So super briefly, what we're talking about is our LLMs, they have attention, transformers. So we have attention layers that move information between token positions. We have MLP layers that can only process information. And today's paper is just looking at sort of the circuits formed between the MLP layers. It's going to use attention, but it's not going to study how the attention patterns get formed. There's this concept of the residual stream that I'll refer to frequently, and this is the data superhighway. Once your text tokens have been embedded, there's this residual stream data superhighway, and the mental model is that each of the layers, whether attention or MLP, they're modifying, twisting, rotating, tugging, tweaking the information that's on here in order to eventually put enough information that it can then get decoded into the next token prediction. So key concept here is that concepts are being represented as directions. There may be some amount of magnitude information, but this is not like in physics where you represent, say, velocity as a vector, and a velocity that's 8 times longer means exactly something moving in the same direction 8 times faster. Okay, we're mostly going to do dot products to see whether or not we get something close to 0, which means the concept's not present, or something large, which means the concept is present. That's mostly all that we're going to do. And as I mentioned briefly a moment ago, we have this issue that we have more concepts, so potentially at least hundreds of millions of concepts that our sophisticated LLMs are trying to represent. And we typically have like tens of thousands of dimensions on the residual stream. That's the size of our models. So what our models need to do is to find, right, they're trying to do next token prediction as best they can. So if they can encode all of the concepts in a way that they can use them, that would be great, but they can't encode them as orthogonal directions. So what we end up seeing is this idea from the toy models paper, where if you have concepts that collide frequently, they did a study with 5 different directions, and the model was not able to represent more than 2 of them in the plane, in a 2-dimensional space. And so you lost the other 3 altogether. If you see this dot in the middle here, they just all become zeros. But once you have enough sparsity that you have concepts that never appear together, some obscure biology concept and the Eiffel Tower and some detailed thing about, I don't know, integrated circuit design. I mean, these are things that just don't appear in the same paragraph at the same time. And so if you did the dot product to test against this green vector, if you had any of these others, you're going to get a non-zero value of some amount. But as long as they never appear together, it doesn't matter that you get a non-zero value. You're not going to actually get a collision. And so with this idea of these polysemantic features that are not orthogonal directions, it's now much, much harder for us to figure out, to read out the information. If they were all orthogonal, we just do something like a spectral decomposition, get the eigenvectors, and we would know what, if it's say a 4,000 dimensional model, we would just run a bunch of test sentences through and figure out what all the 4,000 directions meant. But here, there's now potentially like e to the 4,000 different directions that are almost orthogonal. And so there's many, many, many more directions that are possible, and there's no straightforward way to find them like using spectral decomposition. So I won't talk too much about the attention patterns here, but attention moves information. You can see from one earlier token position to a later token position. And the key concept here is that the queries and the keys are used to calculate how much information is moved from where, but they don't directly contribute to the values on the residual stream. So in this paper, you'll see we're going to use frozen attention patterns, and the queries and the keys really don't play any role whatsoever. All right, so coming up to this paper, we saw that we've got concepts represented as directions. We have this idea of superposition and polysemanticity, and what that means is that our concepts are formed by linear combinations of neurons. And from compressed sensing, we know that we can recover these concepts. So what we're going to do is we're going to build these sparse autoencoders that can do linear combinations. And what we want is to train them in a way that they find as many unique concepts as possible. And so we're going to train them with like an L1 type of loss or something similar in order to encourage sparsity. And in this work, they expanded from sparse autoencoders to a slightly different technology, and that was allowing them to predict the output of MLPs, but instead of showing it in a dense way, showing it in a very sparse way, so that hopefully you get dogs as like a unique concept in your new in this case it's a transcoder. You get the color green as a distinct concept. You get the Eiffel Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, all of these things as distinct concepts, so that you can interpret them well. So how do we do that? So basically, we're going to replace our regular LLM, which has MLPs shown as these boxes. It's not really drawn to scale. And we're going to replace these with this sparse version where we go from something like, say, 14,000 to maybe 40 million different concepts. And again, what we're trying to do is have each one of these not just be some numerical thing, but a very clear human interpretable concept. One concept for the state of Texas, a separate concept for the state of California, San Francisco, Dallas, the Golden Gate Bridge, all of these as unique individual concepts. They built this thing called a cross-layer transcoder. We're not going to talk about that. We talked about that in session 2, but this is the way they train something in order to actually identify these different directions. Previous work has showed that that these directions do appear to be extremely meaningful. The example I gave is they identified a direction with the Golden Gate Bridge, and when you have a sentence that has absolutely nothing to do with the Golden Gate Bridge, if they add the values associated with that direction to the residual stream, you can get things like a sentence where you ask it, what's your favorite sandwich? And it might answer, my favorite sandwich is peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I like to eat them on the Golden Gate Bridge. So you can see where like just adding this direction caused that concept to appear in the response, even though it really logically had no reason to be there. All right. So after they did this, they then connected all of these predicted outputs from the MLPs together. And what they did is they took the attention patterns for a given sentence. So this is no longer a generic model. This is a model built just for one prompt. And they wired them up together with frozen attention patterns so that they're now constants. They froze the normalization layer so that they're just now constants. And then this becomes a giant linear model where the weights connecting the different layers and the different neurons are all just linear. And so although it's very big, it's got like millions of parts, maybe billions of parts, Since they're all connected linearly, there's some very simple math you could do, and you can simply say like, hey, this circle up here, how much was it influenced by this circle down here? How much was it influenced by this circle over there? How much was it influenced by the input word Texas over here? And you can just very directly calculate this, sub-second super fast, all of these influences because it's just completely linear at this point. So the real challenge is now that we've simplified this and we've made it linear, is it still faithful enough to the original LLM to be useful, or is it just something that's so oversimplified that it no longer matches the original model? And so one of the last steps they'll do after they find some patterns is they'll do experiments in order to confirm them. So the patterns are these heavily weighted paths. And so they're going to prune away, they're going to discard all the ones with weights close to zero. They're going to prune away any of the paths that actually don't help predict the next token. So one of the things you'll see in all of the experiments today is that the prompts they used are prompts that kind of lead to one-word answers, okay? Because they're really trying to just figure out all of the contribution to predicting that one next token. If you asked it to do something that required a full paragraph answer, then there's so many tokens, and trying to understand how each of those tokens got predicted would be far, far more complex than if you have a prompt that you know has like a one-word answer in most cases. So that's what they did. And then finally, they did some validation experiments where they were able to either, if they built a graph and said, hey, the way we got the answer to this question, Austin, was we first thought about what's the capital of, we thought about what state is Dallas in, it's Texas. What's the capital of Texas? It's Austin. And that's how we built it up. Then what they can do is they can do tiny little surgical changes to the model where they can zero out, they can erase, negate one of the concepts that appears in the middle of the model and see if that changes the output. They can do things like swap it out and say, well, wherever the Texas concept appears, let's negate that out and let's add California and see if the answer changes from Austin to Sacramento. So they did some of these causal experiments and got some pretty strong results. So last session, we talked about two things. We talked about this multi-step reasoning here, where the prompt was, fact, the capital of the state containing Dallas is Austin. And this is the graph that they use, that they discovered that Claude was using to calculate this next token prediction of Austin. And then they did a bunch of experiments where they deleted capital, they deleted say capital, they deleted say Austin, they deleted Dallas. They replaced Dallas with something else, replaced Texas with something else, tried all these experiments. And the experiments I found quite compelling because by making just a small change to a few floating point numbers here and there, they were able to completely change the behavior of the next token prediction. And then they were even able to make it do other things like keep the input text the same, but in the middle of the LLM change this Texas direction to a California direction they learned from other sentences. And suddenly it goes from 92% Austin to 95% Sacramento, while keeping the entire input text the same and just making a few floating point number changes in a couple places in the model. So quite a relatively very surgical change. The other thing that we looked at, skipping ahead, was planning in poems. And what we saw is that if the prompt is a rhyming couplet, so telling it, I want you to write a rhyming poem, he saw a carrot and had to grab it. His hunger was like a starving, and the word rabbit came up. And then they also did some experiments where they gave it less of this last sentence. That's why I was confused for a moment there. Like they only gave it his hunger, and it had to complete was like a starving and stuff like that. So the very interesting thing that we saw is that when you get to the first line that needs a rhyme, he saw a carrot and had to grab it, comma, and then this new line appears. At the new line, the LLM basically said, I now have enough information to know what I'm going to rhyme with. I'm going to rhyme with grab it. And it started having things like rabbit and habit as proposals that you can see the concepts for those two words sitting in the interior of the LLM as it's getting as it's preparing for the possibility that it's going to rhyme with these words. And so this was very compelling in particular because what they found is that only at this new line character um, uh, did did trying to change it from rabbit to green work. So it wasn't storing rabbit all along in the later tokens. I don't know if you can see my mouse. His hunger was like starving. Um, if you changed rabbit to green in one of these other places, like on the word like, it still said rabbit. So it was very clear that where the information for needing to rhyme um, with a word like rabbit was located in the interior of the model was at the new line. It was not living anywhere else in the second sentence. And so there you can see very clearly the role that attention plays, because attention allows it to look back, whatever this is, about 8 tokens, and grab information that's been sitting here for 8 tokens doing nothing. And then now that we're at the end of the second line, the second stanza, or whatever that is, the LLM's able to say, oh, great, I need to now finish this. I need to rhyme. What was it that I was thinking I was going to rhyme with? And there were some other conclusions that they looked at as well. So again, by building this local replacement model, which is local, unique to a given prompt, we can not only see what the next token prediction is, but we can see directions showing up in the interior of the LLM at different token positions. A reminder, all of these different directions are hand labeled, so they show their work, and so you can look at the sentences that actually light up with these different directions, and you can decide for yourself, hey, did they just make this stuff up? Or is this direction that they claim is associated with Dallas or the state of Texas? Does this actually seem like a reasonable name for these different directions? All right, so that was kind of a quick recap to get us to where we are now, getting ready to look at the third example. So they have the two-step reasoning and the poems. We're going to look now at the third example in this article on the biology. You're muted, Roger.
Oh, thank you for catching that. I wanted to see if I could ask a quick question. I didn't want to interrupt your summary, but there was a slide. I don't know how quickly you can navigate back to that, like Pentagon slide with the direction.
Yeah.
Um, the question that came to mind, yeah, right there. I know you said that its direction is what counts, magnitude doesn't. But I'm wondering if a positive, like, does the sign of the dot product matter? Is it only a positive dot product that says this is a sign direction match?
Mm.
Or
So my understanding is yes, it's signed. So
okay,
sign SIGN, not
yeah,
not
yeah,
sine
yeah,
cosine.
right.
Um, and if you're like passing things through some kind of ReLU-like function, okay, then zero
Okay,
and negative all get chopped off.
not direction.
Uh,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
perfect. That's
And
great.
that's why like for this green one over here, these two that have sort of the somewhat the opposite direction are not really the threats. It's this yellow one and dark green
Ones
one
that are
over
closer
here that would have positive dot products,
overlap. Okay, great.
right? And
Thank
then this
you.
is just in 2 dimensions. You can imagine it could be in lots and lots of dimensions, right?
Yeah.
Um, in this earlier paper, the toy models paper, if I recall, they found what seemed to be small clusters of features. So if you sort of have 4,000 dimensions to play with, if you broke it into pairs of two and you uh, uh, clumped a bunch of different concepts in that plane as a 5-pointed star or a 7-pointed star or whatever, right? Um, then you only have a handful of possible conflicts to worry about. If you just did the thing where theoretically you can have e to the 4,000 number of things, then you have to like keep track of all of the other things to make sure you're not colliding with them. So I don't know if it's a intentional thing or if it's just with the random weight initialization, you're more likely to just get these clusters of features than to get like one uniform global set of, things that don't collide with each other that much.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see how those directions evolve during training. That
Yeah.
some of
It would be
these,
hard because you have to sort of like train your
yeah, I
sparse,
know it's,
you know,
yeah,
understanding stuff throughout. But yes, what I suspect is right, like like here we're looking at this pentagon sort of omnisciently and saying, oh, we had five different concepts that we played with in this toy experiment in two dimensions. But the way the real LLM is working is it's just getting sentences and trying to predict the next token. And so it doesn't
right.
really even know if this
It's not
yellow
trying to do.
concept, the Eiffel Tower, is going to come up a lot, or if it's a really rare thing that in a trillion tokens is only going to come up four times, right? And it doesn't know how often the yellow and the green are going to appear together. So it's not like it can just sort of say, let me index the frequencies and the
Yeah,
co-occurrence frequencies of all these words and plan out, my directions in advance. So
right.
that's the thing that is kind of wild about
That's
it. But that's
fascinating,
also why
isn't
it
it?
takes so long to train because it's going to pick some bad things. It's going to say, "Whoa, let me just put blue and red, in this clump together," and that's a terrible idea because those two concepts are going to co-occur a lot. And so
Right,
then eventually the loss will somehow push blue out of that clump into a different clump and so that you no longer keep getting penalized because it's like you know it says the word blue but it's also lighting up red and it's doing other like bad things or whatever or else if you have like this yellow one here and this dark green one here when you add them together then you get this other direction and so it's like if you have blue and red in the same sentence all of a sudden I don't know, Rome, the city of Rome is this direction that's in the middle, and due to the interference, the red and the blue cancel out, and all you get is Rome. And it's like, what, you know, why would my LLM say like, what color do you think I should paint the bathroom? And it says Rome, right?
right.
And so you're going to get a really terrible loss, and then eventually the representations will shift.
Yeah, and presumably there's some of the directions kind of settle in fairly early, dog
Yeah,
and car,
yeah,
whereas
or even more
Eiffel
like
Tower
like
takes,
like language concepts like nouns and verbs,
yeah,
like subjects and
find their
actions
space.
and things that they get operated on. Maybe that happens pretty darn early.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting.
So, but yes, that
But
there is a branch of mechanistic interpretability that looks at how things evolve during training, not just what the final product is. But I agree. I think that would be really fun to see and probably quite expensive.
yeah, great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the question. All right. So let me go back to the paper. And so again, we had multi-step reasoning, we had the poems. So then the next one they talk about is multilingual circuits. And the question is, um, this Claude haiku model knows multiple languages. Do concepts get shared across the languages? And so in this case, they have like the idea of large, something being large or small, right? Is largeness language agnostic, or is large, like large in English, and in Mandarin, and I don't know what it is in French, grand or something like that or whatever. Um, are they just three very different uh, concepts? Um, and so what they're showing here in this first set of charts is that when they have the prompt, the opposite of small is, and then they say the same thing approximately in Mandarin, and then they say the same thing in French, you'll see that this direction, for example, for say large in the middle here, is the same one that appears. It's the same exact direction that appears in the Chinese sentence. It's the same exact direction that appears in the French sentence. Okay. You'll notice a few places, though, that this idea of opposite at the very beginning of the sentence, this is a different direction in each of the three sentences. So there's an English version of the word opposite, there's a Chinese version, and there's a French version. So where it says multilingual in the smaller print below, that's where they say this is the exact same direction in all the sentences. And wherever you see a language, then that's where. So it's this interesting thing where if you look at, I guess they sort of have this slightly shaded background. These three in the middle are multilingual concepts. And then for whatever reason, when it gets to the quotation mark, somehow that cues the LLM to say, well, I understand the concept of large in a multilingual, very generic way, but I have to predict the next token. And since this sentence is in English, I'm going to use the English version for large. Or this sentence is in Chinese, so now I'm going to use the Chinese word for large or the French word for large. So interestingly enough, we do see these language agnostic concepts showing up in haiku. And on one sense, it's logical because you could say, uh, if everything, I don't know how many languages it knows, but let's just, for round numbers, say it knows 10 languages. If everything you always represented language independent, it's going to take 10 times as much storage. So to the extent that you can do some intermediate computations, saying with the generic idea of large, the generic idea of blue, the generic idea of whatever, then that's going to save you in terms of how much stuff you need to be able to represent internally. So they do some more experiments here with this multilingual stuff.
Ted, quick question on that. Are all those
Yep.
languages, like some languages have the modifier in front of the noun and some have them afterwards? Are those languages all same order?
In this sentence, the adjectives are not modifying nouns. They're just being treated as concepts. So like quote small. So it's not a small ball or ball small. It's just small.
Hmm.
So I think the word order is relatively similar. Um,
Okay, maybe it's not appropriate for this. I guess I'm wondering when they have them out of order, if these multilingual concepts still show up with the same connectivity, even when the tokens are in a different orders, kind of where I was going. But I guess you're right in this.
yeah, yeah. So that would be a different thing. It does look
Yeah.
like um, the Chinese word order is slightly different. Um,
Yeah.
so you see the word small appears at the beginning of the sentence.
Okay.
Okay. So it says small and then it asks for the opposite of that. Whereas in the English and the French, it says the opposite of, and then small comes relatively late in the sentence. So there is some slightly different word order.
So the graphs they're drawing, though, they're drawing the same graph. So they already kind of normalized the graph? Because normally
Yeah,
the
yeah.
graph.
So if we go to the detailed graph, okay, and you look at small, right? So if you see these two pink tokens lighting up,
Yep. Yep.
right? Uh, um, they're both at token position two because that's where it's quote and then the word small is right here.
Okay.
Okay. So it makes sense that they're going to show up at token two. But my guess is if we look at the English detailed graph, then
Because
small,
small and opposite, I guess, are the two you want to see, right?
so small, you can see it's these three right here are the really prominent small ones. And so they're obviously showing up right here at this token position. where the word
Okay.
small is. And they're
Okay.
in relatively early layers. Okay. So that's usually the pattern that you'll see is when the concept being represented is the actual input word, it's going to be in a relatively early layer. It doesn't take much work to say the word was small, I'm going to represent the concept of smallness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That
Okay. So in the simplified one, they've already
yeah.
adjusted for
Yes.
this
So
token
so
order.
in these graphs, you should never treat horizontal position or vertical position literally.
Got it. Okay.
Right? These are meant to be conceptual. And once again, they've also simplified them. Okay.
Yep.
So so this is for understanding but not accuracy.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. And so let's do some experiments on this. So in this one, it looks like what they did is they overwrote the opposite concept with the synonym concept. Okay. And so the opposite of small is, and now the answer changes to little. All right. Um, and remember, in all of these, they never change the input text. They just do some small edits of the floating point numbers in a few places. Okay. Another surgical experiment they did. So this was operation swap. They said change the antonym to synonym concept. Okay. They changed small to hot. So the input word is small, but then they overwrote in the few places where we saw, right? It was like 5 places or whatever that, or actually there was only 3 where small really lit up strongly. So in those 3 places, they change um, uh, the direction small to hot, and then the top prediction becomes cold. And then here's one that I really don't understand, but because the quote has language specific. The character, by the way, might be different in Chinese or whatever. But I think in English and French, the character is the same. It's just the context in which the character appears is an English sentence or a French sentence. And so at the very, very first layer, it can't know what the context is because all it knows is like the input token. Okay. But then once you hit the first attention layer, it can bring in what language am I currently, speaking. And so they replaced the concept of a quotation mark in an English sentence with the concept of a quotation mark in a Chinese sentence and keeping the entire rest of the sentence the opposite of small is, just changing that quotation mark, the output character instead of the English token big became the Chinese token uh, uh, da for the word big. So once again, you see here, they're defending these computation graphs by doing little small surgeries on different parts to say, if this is truly the way the LLM works, then obviously if we did a massive thing, right? If you had a person and you said, I cut off the entire left half of their body and they weren't able to walk anymore, it's like, well, yeah, but duh, you did this massive intervention. But if you said all I did was this little thing and I cut the ACL and all of a sudden um, the the person had tremendous difficulty walking, then you say, oh, okay. But they could do everything else. They could eat, they could smell, they could see, they could hear, they could talk. Then you say, okay, this particular thing that you did surgery on seems very important for walking and not for other things. And so that's why these sort of very surgical experiments, um, um, in my opinion, are quite compelling.
It's kind of wild to me that that whole language hint is just in that quote token. Like
It's not
the rest
really
of the
just in the
sentences.
quote token. There's other places it might live, but it is wild to me that there appears to be a unique direction for quoted English words that's a different direction from quoted French or quoted Chinese words, right?
Yeah.
There may be other things that indicate language, context as well. Get what I'm saying? So I don't know if you were
Yeah.
saying that
Yeah.
or not. I'm
Yeah.
just I'm just clarifying. Quote is not the only way in which it tells you that you're in a French sentence, but it does seem to have a dedicated direction for quoting. I think one
So
reason why quotes might do that is because you can imagine there's a lot of sentences in certain types of text where you the sentence is in one language and then in quotes you quote something in a different language.
Mm.
Okay,
So
so
it's not so
that's my
much
intuition that because you have this thing where you have a perfectly good English sentence and then you hit a quote and you say some stuff in Latin and then end quote and then you go back to English. That's why quotes get this special emphasis of
like a
I'm
language
going to
transition.
change I'm going to change what language I'm speaking at the quote mark and at the end quote mark.
Yeah, yeah.
That'd just be a guess that's a reasonably common occurrence in the training set.
So if
Yeah.
I didn't have a quote, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Well, then, if that's true, then the fact that you use the quotes around like small here, does that kind
Mhm.
of make it a separate, I don't want to call it separate token because that's a bad term, but something more important than to pay attention to? Kind
I
of
don't
call it
know.
out?
Yeah, I mean, I might have to reread all the details in this section here,
Uh-huh.
um, but also, clearly it
I'm
could have
just,
changed language where small is, right?
no,
But in this case, it just didn't.
I'm just wondering if it's picking up on the fact that that's a quoted thing. You see, it's also in the Chinese and in the French versions, they're delineating it there. Or is that just an artifact? Is that really the way they do it? Or,
Again, I mean, this is just the prompts that the authors, the researchers came up with. You could
Mhm.
try dropping the quotes around small, you
Yeah,
know,
that's what I
and it
was
would,
wondering.
yeah. My guess is it would work, but probably you might lose a few percentage points on the confidence
Hmm.
because the quotes make it very clear what you want the opposite of,
Right, right.
right? But otherwise, I suspect you're still going to get large, you know,
Okay.
just maybe not quite as high of a probability.
Okay.
Jerry, it'd be interesting also to not only drop the quotes on small, but also drop the end quote. I mean, the sentence still works without the end quote.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
would it then be that is, there's an English is and a Chinese is, and it
right.
shifts the answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be yeah, I agree. That would be a very fun experiment. Um, uh, uh, yeah, it would be cool just to see how this model, understands being in different languages, right?
Yeah,
But so far, what we're showing is what the researchers were mostly looking at was not how it keeps track of language, but just does it have a completely separate bucket for each language, or are there shared things?
yeah,
And at
Hmm.
least the idea of smallness and largeness is uh, can be represented in a language agnostic way. And then at some point prior to predicting the next token, you combine this language agnostic concept, this multilingual concept, with some kind of information that tells you what language you're speaking in, and then that then becomes the language specific concept when you
yeah.
combine those two things,
Hmm.
right? So here you see, like, I love the fact that they that you can click and hover on all these things and you can get all the details behind them, but I keep
Hmm.
accidentally hovering over boxes. And um, so so this multilingual large combines with this English quote again, um, to turn into to convert it from a multilingual large to a language specific large concept. And so this is the one that promotes, notice it says say large. This promotes a particular token, which is token, 5,691, which is the one we say LARGE, right? But over here, the French one, that's token 27,812, and that's the one that we say is GRAND, when we decode it for humans to read. Yeah, question?
Yeah, so the quote thing that we were just discussing, I was thinking it's sort of a, it's like the trigger for the next token, right? And so if you compare the English and the French, you could, let's say you did everything in English, and then at the very end, instead of the is token, I don't know if there's a single token for is, but if there's an is token, if you replace it with the as token, I don't know how to pronounce it, then would you get French? So something like that. And then so the quote was sort of a
Yep.
maybe a uniform way to do that last word trigger was how this came across to me.
Yeah, I think we could continue and we could do more experiments similar to this, and we could try and figure out whether or not replacing English is with French s, right? Whether that's enough to cause it to switch languages and start continuing in French. Or maybe there are more other directions, more other concepts hidden internal to the model that we need to find, and we might need to actually zero out some of the English concepts and switch them to French. I don't remember. We'll scroll down. I don't remember that being an experiment that shows up on the next couple.
I think this code has more to do with like when you have like text in Chinese or English or French, the code gets encoded as a separate token than it would in like if the whole sentence was English and the code came up versus if the whole sentence was in Chinese and the code came up. Like surprisingly, it's like the it gets like a separate token, but like it is different. The value of the token itself is different.
Yeah, I don't know about the. I'm pretty sure the English and French, the tokens, the literal text input tokens are identical. But what we're saying is actually let's just take a look.
Yeah.
So quote French is these four. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's these three here and this one. Okay. And so we can see actually they are quite early. It's like the second and the third layer. They're quite early in the model. Okay. But it is after the first layer. And so there is the possibility that attention from the first layer brought in some kind of context information that says we're speaking French.
Yeah, I see.
It's also interesting, those don't seem to be on language transitions. Those are just, I'm not sure I'm reading this right, but it looks like those are single language. Like the quote, you had the sentence in one language, a quote, and the sentence continues in the same language.
Yeah, in this case, we're not switching languages, but
Right.
internal to the model, it has a direction that is unique to quotes before French or before English or before whatever. And so in this case, it's not about switching language. It's just about somehow it knows what language it's in, and it combines that with the literal. Let me see if I can click on this. Not really seeing it, but the literal fact that it is a quote combines with some kind of context to say, now I'm going to have this particular direction, right? These 4,000 floating point numbers, this direction that means a quote preceding a French word.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you would. I guess if you were just in one of those things, examples that I was talking about, where you wanted to quote Latin or something else and you wanted to switch language on the fly, it would just have to, from context, say, oh, here's a quote and it's for a special term, and the possibility that this term might be in another language goes up. And then at some point, the next token prediction's like, well, you could say large, or you could say the Latin word, K or whatever, you know what I mean? And then, eventually it's like, okay, I'm down to like a few different possibilities. I'm going with semper, and And so now it's a Latin word, but it doesn't mean that it was 100% sure the next word was going to be Latin, right? It might have had some choices in different language, but ultimately
Yeah.
next token, it won out at some point.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry, I have one more question. I skipped last time, so maybe you answered it last time. If you did, I'll look at the presentation. But they built a model that can look at the original model and get this sparse representation, right? But how do they change the directions? What do they do to model? Oh, you have a sparse representation for a word. How do you inject it back into the model?
Yeah. So when you find actually, let's just leave this up for a second. When you find a sparse representation, so what we're doing is we're predicting the outputs of the MLPs at every layer.
Mhm.
Okay. And so this MLP, what it actually outputs is this 4,000 4,000 float thing, which could be what we think of as one direction, but it could actually be a couple different directions combined, right? It could be saying multiple things at once. Just like if you had orthogonal directions, you could be saying up to 4,000 different things simultaneously. Okay. Um, so then we build this sparse transcoder to predict each of the MLPs. So when we find for example, Chinese quote feature in our transcoder at layer 3, we know that this corresponds to layer 3. So if you want to subtract out that component, you just run that one component through the decoder half of your transcoder, and you know exactly what that output of the MLP is that it's predicting. And so
I,
that's the
I,
value that you can multiply by
I
-1,
s-
or in most cases, they did it stronger, that
yeah,
-2 to subtract it out.
yeah, I see. That's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. So you do have to do some bookkeeping to remember where you found that feature in order to go there and actually
Yeah.
apply the floating point number change there. But
Oh,
but still, if in the grand scheme of things, right? If this is a whatever 24, 36 layer model, and there's millions of different directions, the fact that you found whatever these 4 spots, right?
yeah.
And 3 of them in layer 2, one of them's in layer
The
3.
one.
So in layer 2, you're sort of adding 3 sets of negative numbers, and in layer 3, you're adding 1 set of negative numbers, and that's enough to change the output from English big to French or Chinese big.
Okay.
It's a
That
it's a
also,
relatively small surgical, change to the model.
I thought the LLMs would be really susceptible to perturbations or something because what we have is an estimate of the direction, not the actual direction itself. And we're subtracting and adding direction that would add some noise to it, but it turns out it does not.
The way I interpret this on the biology article is, if the LLM were like this giant, I don't know how to say it, but this giant vat that you pour a bunch of stuff in, and you mix it up, and stuff sort of slowly coalesces,
Okay.
and you wind up with, hey, I think the answer is large. Okay, then you wouldn't necessarily expect perturbations small perturbations to easily have large effects. Okay.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if you think of it in the other extreme, like a desk calculator, okay,
Mm-hmm.
where you punch in a bunch of numbers and you say plus and you hit equals, in
Yeah,
in
it's
a
gonna,
in the desk calculator, what you would expect is
it's,
any perturbation could have
it,
catastrophic
yeah,
effects,
yeah,
right?
yes.
Because it's got a very narrow skeleton. There's all these paths that are in the calculator that don't get used when you're doing addition,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's paths for square root, and there's paths for this and that and that. But if you're on the path it actually uses, any perturbation you make can be potentially massive.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes
And so
sense.
I feel that this on the biology paper is making a strong argument that there are circuits in it that are sort of more
Kind of
narrow, or
error correction going on inside.
yeah. So as opposed to something that's far more diffuse and redundant.
Okay. Okay. That's pretty cool. Thank
Okay.
you.
We know that there's a fair amount of redundancy in LLMs. You can you can do quite a bit of messing around with them and deleting layers and things, and they still work reasonably well because a lot of these concepts are distributed. And what we see here in this graph is, right, so this small multilingual has three features. If you look at the top of the this thing, it has one, two, and three, right?
Mm.
And this quote has four, and opposite has two, antonym has eight, right? So you can already see there's some redundancy
Yeah.
here where if you did certain things and if they're at different layers, then there's a certain amount. So there is the degree to which it does have that redundancy. And by the way, I don't mean that they're all exactly copies of each other, but they
Yeah.
do have a lot of overlap, right?
Yes,
So that's
similarities.
what gives it that robustness. But the thing is, if you find all eight of the most important antonym concepts and you negate those eight of them
Yeah,
fairly
it's probably good.
surgically, now all of a sudden you've you wiped out that redundancy
Exactly.
and you're able to have a massive effect where you change antonym to synonym, and instead of large, now you get little as the next
Little,
token
yeah.
prediction.
Uh,
So that's pretty cool. Again, it shows the degree to which there are these narrow purpose built circuits versus a giant coalescing of things.
Yeah.
It,
Thank-
the other analogy that pops to my mind is that each one of these is a direction in a highly thousands of dimensions, right? High dimensional
Mhm.
vector,
Mhm.
and you may be making a fairly small surgical change, but it's very specific about its direction. So, like I remember in the CNN classifiers, right? It could classify this as a jet airplane, and you could make something that to us is imperceptible changes to it, and it comes out zebra. But it's small changes in exactly the right direction to change the classifier. And in here, it's kind of the same thing, is that it's robust because most directions don't affect it. But and you make small changes in some directions, it doesn't change it, but it's a very specific direction that you can change the output.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things with the images is that the CNNs are actually um, not fully generalized. Okay,
Yeah.
so the reality is, let's say you had a picture of a dog, but within the fur, you modified the values of some of the color values in a way that to the human eye you can't even really see anymore. But it's somehow whatever, and that gets the thing to go 51%. I think it's a turtle or whatever. Okay,
Mhm.
what I would argue is that in that case, there actually are no real dogs that have hidden turtle shaped patterns in their fur. And there was in the training of that CNN, there was never examples of dogs that had different hidden patterns in their fur to teach it to ignore those patterns and to pay attention to the bigger picture of what's the shape of
uh,
this animal and what's its whatever,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so that's where I think that it's a little bit what you said, but it's also that what we gave the model in that case was something that was truly very out of domain from its training. Okay. Um, there were
Uh, well,
early.
I mean, the ones that I've seen, I mean, it's not out of domain because it still looks to me like a turtle. No, let's see, you were going to turtle. Let me start with car and end up with zebra. It still looks
Yeah,
like a car. You added what was, it looked like just noise to it. It wasn't turtle. It didn't change it to be more turtleish. It just was noise,
yeah.
imperceptible noise.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe
Yeah.
I'm carrying the analogy too far, but just the idea is that I have this sense that that we're making small surgical changes that affect the outcome. Um, but in general, the language model can still be fairly robust because it is such a high dimensional space that small changes in these little directions that don't matter don't change the output. That's all I was trying to.
Yep. Yeah. No. Yeah. I'm thinking to myself whether or not it's really. I agree. The phenomenon is the same. That these smaller perturbations get
Mhm.
us an effect. I'm just trying to think about: is it really actually the same mechanism, or is it a different mechanism that has the same,
Yeah,
effect of a perturbation? So maybe
yeah,
I'll have to
yeah,
think about that a little bit more. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So if we continue with this multilingual stuff, I showed this one. We can change antonym to synonym. You can change small to hot. You can change English to Chinese. I'm trying to remember what else did they do here. Um, so this is the same thing, but now we have this new chart down here that shows. In this case, they subtracted opposite and they added synonym. And the question was, how strongly do you have to do this? So they didn't do -1 times the direction for opposite. They ended up doing like -5, I think it says. And then for synonym,
Mhm.
they did plus. So I think last time we talked a little bit about part of the
Yeah.
reason for that could be, remember, we pruned away all these nodes with smaller weights. It could be that there's like 3 nodes that are very clear synonym, but there might be many. There could be like 30 other nodes that have a small amount of synonym contribution, and in total, that might add up to a non-negligible amount. Okay, individually they seem to have small weights, but combined, 30 of them might actually. And so that's one of the reasons why I think when you're subtracting things, you need to. Um, but I do think also that the fact that you have to do it more than 1x, and in many cases, much more than even 2x, I think that's a sign that this computation graph is imperfect. The more accurate this graph was perfectly how it happened, 1x should have been better. Okay.
Mhm.
And so whenever you see a number more than 2, it's usually a sign that there's more going on. We've simplified it. This isn't the whole story. I still think that as long as the edits are very surgical, it's a compelling argument. But it does go to show that, yeah, this is not everything about what's going on. And so you can see here where they have sort of these transition points to say, like, hey, the predictions don't really change, up till 3x. And then at 4x, they finally start changing. And so then they arrived at 5, 6x is what you need in order to sort of confidently be on the other side of changing what the next token prediction is. Similar graph for changing um, small to hot.
Hmm.
This did not, you can see this did not require nearly as much of a change. So what was this one again? This was, oh, changing the concept of opposites to synonym. So it might be that smallness, we fairly accurately captured it. And so then we can swap it for hotness fairly accurately because we only need 1.5x. Whereas the idea of a synonym and an antonym or whatever, those concepts are probably far more complicated, and the handful of nodes we did not perfectly capture that. Changing the language required quite a bit of effort, 5, 6x. And then they had a little bit more stuff on um, the French circuit where they went into a little more detail. Like you see here, there's this predict size direction that we hadn't been talking about in the above more simplified graphs. So basically, it's saying I should be predicting a size, and the size is going to be large, and we're speaking French, so therefore I'm going to say the word large in French. And then how general are they? Oh, so what about other things? So let's see here. They found eggplant, color, and purple multilingual, Peru, capitals, Lima multilingual, gold, atomic symbols, AU. So there's quite a few things that they found are multilingual, but it's certainly not everything. And this chart, which I believe Jerry used for the meetup
Hmm.
advertisement, um, the x-axis for each of these charts is the depth of the model. So the far left is where the tokens come in, and the far right is where the next words are predicted. And so you can see in general, the pattern is that uh, where there are more multilingual concepts is in the middle. And that seems pretty intuitive. At the beginning, you're just decoding things and you're going to be very language specific. And at the very end, you have to output in a single language. You cannot output a multilingual concept. Um, you have to actually use a word in a particular language. So it makes sense to me that in the middle. They also note that the bigger model, Haiku versus the smaller model, has more multilingual, a higher percentage of multilingual concepts. Not sure what to make of that. It makes sense, but um, it's I personally find it kind of hard to reason about. So the larger model has a higher dimension and it has more parameters. In theory, it just has more capacity overall. It could use that capacity to specialize, but it seems like it actually doesn't do that. It actually um, seems to convert more things to generic multilingual concepts before converting them back to language specific concepts.
Ted, is that they're switching languages though, right? They're doing French to English or French to Chinese and English to Chinese. So you've got multiple variants, don't you?
I have to reread exactly what they did here, but I think this experiment is different from the sentence that we saw at the beginning about
Oh,
the
okay.
opposite. This is just they ran a bunch of sentences and somehow compared in these sentences that are supposed to be I don't know what the right word is. I'll say translations of each other.
Hmm.
To what extent do we get the exact same direction somewhere in the middle of the model? And to what extent do we get different values in the middle of the model? And so they're saying here in Haiku, in these middle layers, 20% of the directions are identical, whether you pass the English, the French, or the Chinese sentence into the
Mm.
model. You see the exact same, maybe exact is not the word I should use. You see the same floating point numbers to a certain degree. Okay, 20% of the time. Whereas at the very beginning and the end, it's close to 0% of the time. You see the same floating point.
And these language
Okay.
models, different sizes, but they would have been trained on the same data sets, I assume, same language mixtures.
I don't remember, but since Anthropic are the people who built Claude Haiku, and then the researchers built this smaller 18-layer model, I'm guessing they had very similar training text, but possibly not identical. The 18-layer one might have been trained less, just
I,
to save compute.
yeah, I was thinking that not the quantity, but more just the distribution of languages.
Yes, I'm guessing they would be very similar choices around what
Right.
kinds of text. Yeah. There's a small section here. Do models think in English? And I don't think there's any charts, but the short takeaway was that they found that uh, English does seem to be sort of the default answer for output tokens, and that something else needs to sort of override it to say, be French, be Chinese, be some other language. My guess is that the training corpus has much more English than any other language. And so it it has clearly biased the model. So it's not very surprising to me, but a worthy experiment that they should just, test.
That's on
All
the
right.
output side, is that right? So
Yes,
that's
yes,
so it's not
for its next
necessarily
tokens.
Yeah, so that question, do models think in English? It seems like the bigger models may be thinking in multilingual concepts.
Oh,
They may
sorry.
be
Yes, yes,
inclined,
you're right. You're
they may
right.
be
There's
inclined
two
to,
different things, whether they
yeah,
think in English or whether they default their output to
to speak
English.
in, yeah, yeah.
You're right. Um, yeah, so there's quite a bit of evidence here that the Claude Haiku model more and more does not think in English. It thinks
Mhm.
in a language independent way, and then closer to outputting the token says, ah, now how will I express this agnostic concept as a
Mhm.
next token? Oh, well, we've been speaking in French, so I guess I should use the French word that closely aligns to this concept. All right, this addition concept is probably going to take a little bit of time to go through, more time than we have, um, but it's very cool. So this example is different from the other ones. In the other examples, what we saw is the local model for one individual prompt. Okay, what they're going to do for addition is they're going to do addition of two-digit numbers. There's 100 possibilities for the first number, 100 possibilities for the second number. So there's 10,000 different two-digit addition problems. All the charts we're going to see under addition is going to be them averaging together all 10,000 charts. Okay? So just want to like set the scene because this is like a very different thing. And so what you're going to see is there are going to be different patterns. Okay, and so darker orange means that things light up with strong activations. Okay, if you see, and so the y-axis is, I don't remember which is the first, which is the second number, but the y-axis is the first number, the x-axis is the second number. Okay, and so when you see this blob of activations, it means that like, hey, if the first number is 36 plus or minus 5, and if the second number is 60 plus or minus 5, then it's sort of like this is the region we're in. So this is a very coarse approximation, right? Just like you can imagine some people might have an intuition that if you said 50 something plus 50 something, 40 something plus 60 something, they might very quickly be like, it's like 100 something. 20 something plus 80 something. They'd be like, it's like 100 something, right? That's kind of what this attention pattern, or it's not attention, that's what this activation pattern, wrong word, sorry. You see this pattern where it's got like these different dots? Okay. Um, so this is lighting up anytime the the first number is a two-digit number and ends in 9. So is 9, modulo 10 is 9. And then this other one is where the other one uh, ends in a 9. So this is lighting up for anything that's 19, 29, 39, 49, or whatever, plus 19, 29, 39, 49, 59, up to 99. And so what this pattern would be very useful for is these are the ones where 9 plus 9 is 8, right? But there's a similar thing, which is this diagonal pattern that lines up whenever the sum of the two is something. So this is like two things that would add up to 8. This could be a different diagonal pattern where it could be 9 plus 9, or it could be 0 plus 8, or it could be 1 plus 7, or it could be 2 plus 6, or it could be 3 plus 5, right? And so if you see this diagonal stripe, that's all the cases where it has the same. So these are the different kinds of patterns that you can see. And remember, this is all 10,000 of them averaged together. And so where you see white, it means that the activation was completely dead. And so if you have the sentence, calculate 20 plus 80, this particular neuron, this particular direction, didn't fire at all. Okay, so if I were to like think about how to do long addition, there'd be a handful of concepts that I would need. I wouldn't need that many. Turns out that what what's in these LLMs is something that I think could be made better, could be optimized. So maybe somebody will be able to come up with a training regimen that instead of just giving it text, they give it a few like some kinds of addition problems and try to get it to learn a more efficient way. So basically, the example they're going to give is 36 plus 59. So calculate 36 plus 59. All right. And what you can see is we have these different patterns. Okay. So this diagonal stripy pattern is things where the sum of the two numbers, the ending digit is a 5. Okay. And this pattern over here is similar to one above, where it's any number ending in a 6 plus any number ending in a 9, which is also numbers that sum to 5, but it has some slightly different information, I guess, because it could relate to carries or whatever. This pattern is not perfect. It's got some horizontal stuff to it, but it's predominantly vertical stripes, which is the second number ends in a 9. If you saw horizontal stripes, that would be the first number ends in a particular digit. And so the really weird thing is some of these ones over here. So this one on the left is very coarse, and it's saying any number around 40 plus a number around 50 is going to have a result that's somewhere around 90. And then this guy here is this medium but not quite fine-grained thing, which lights up for numbers that are like 36, give or take a couple, plus a number that's near 60, give or take a couple, is going to give you an answer that's 96, give or take 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then this one over here is numbers that add up to exactly 95, and this is numbers that add up to 92 plus or minus, a couple. So there's a bunch of redundancy in here, which again, we did talk about redundancy before, and I think that's one of the things we see is that this is a little less brittle. And remember, it's not only doing 2-digit addition. Sometimes it might be doing 3-digit addition. Sometimes it might be doing other kinds of mathematical operations. So some of these features might be useful for some other use case that doesn't necessarily apply here. But it is kind of wild because these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 features is more than you need in order to do addition of 2-digit numbers. And this one, like the approximately 40 plus approximately 50, just doesn't seem terribly useful to me. But it's pretty wild. And remember, each of these is a unique direction. And so if they had showed us the average of the 10,000 different activations for a different thing, instead of 36 plus 59, if they had showed us 27 plus 48, we likely would have seen very similar to these 8, but they would be different directions. They'd be directions for the first number ends in, whatever I said, a 7. The second number ends in an 8 instead of the second number ends in a 9, and numbers that sum to approximately whatever, So they didn't exhaustively show us all these different combinations, but it's pretty wild that it's doing this, and the model gets all of the 2-digit math correct. Okay. And when they tried single-digit numbers, it basically had just fully memorized the single-digit addition table. So like, your second grade teacher would be really, really happy because the LLM just had like perfectly memorized all of the single-digit sums. But this 2-digit was hard enough that it had to go through some, you can see these middle machinations. And it got the right answer right for all 10,000 2-digit addition problems. But it got it in a way that's like, that's not how I would have done it.
But it looks like it used a lot of neurons to do this, a lot of directions.
Yeah. So you can imagine that this adds something that ends in 9. There's 10 of these, right? And something ending in a 6 plus something ending in a 9, there's 100 of those. Right? Things that sum
That's
to
just for
5.
2-digit. Yeah.
Yeah, right? The other thing that, we don't have time to go into too much detail, but that they talked about is that these features don't just show up in problems where you ask it to calculate something. Anytime numbers appear, these features get activated sort of like in case you
Huh.
wanted to do something, because in language you don't always tell the model up front you're doing a calculation, right? Sometimes you might say Sally has 3 apples and 5 bananas and 2 cherries. How many fruit does Sally have total, right? So you didn't know when you were seeing the numbers that you were going to ask for them to be added together, but then later on you did. And so that's why some of these features fire in contexts that don't necessarily apply. I think they said in some of these you can actually see where it was like, oh, this could be like a CSV file or a spreadsheet or something, and it might just immediately think like, oh, maybe you're going to ask me to total a column or some, whatever. But it's just kind of crazy. Like, you know, you've got a list of numbers, and it's immediately like some of these features that are firing are are for these various addition features.
Really, it's also kind of interesting because the humans also are like constantly predicting what's gonna happen next, right? So it's kind of like interesting to see the
Mhm.
LLM is also doing kind of the same thing, like expecting what's gonna happen next and preparing for that. Maybe it doesn't
Mm,
happen, but like kind of
yeah,
interesting to see.
I wonder if
that's a
that
that's
makes
a
a
really
difference.
good point. If I could just jump on that for 1 second, my wife is a teacher, right? And she has like a whatever master's in reading, and so I think one of the things that you teach young kids, learners, is that they cannot devote all of their attention just to reading the words on the page. For good comprehension, they have to be predicting. They
Yeah.
have to be saying,
Hmm.
"Ooh, is Johnny going to get in trouble?" You know, and you have to have those kinds of meta thoughts, or else you can't, because by the time you see you would have to reread paragraphs and sentences constantly because something later came that connected. But if you were connecting the dots in advance while you're reading it, then when the thing happens, you're like, oh yeah, I was totally thinking Johnny is going to get in trouble for doing that,
Mhm.
and then you don't have to go back and read it.
Or you might say, wow, that didn't happen the way I was expecting it. And,
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it
Yeah,
piqued your
then
interest
you
in a different way.
The, the same way that this LLM is expending energy calculating a bunch of features that it may not use. It may not ultimately get asked to add things, right?
Yeah.
But
Or it may,
I love
it,
that point, because I do think that people on many levels do this, where they're
yeah,
planning ahead for
uh,
things that might happen. If they're really strong readers and speakers,
Mhm.
you can't just wait until like, I got to say the next word. What am I going to say? Like, you have to kind of plan ahead a little bit.
yeah, but like the LLM is planning in terms of text, which is quite inefficient, right? So that's why like the paper like Roger presented last time was kind of interesting. Like it was planning in some sort of like higher dimensional space rather than text. Uh,
Yeah, very cool.
And it seems to me that two things. One, it doesn't necessarily have to predict like this might be a 1 or 6 or whatever. The way a person would do it, you might just read it and say, that could be important. Yeah, it's raising some sort of thing that in language terminology you could attend to later on.
Yeah.
The
And then
other,
and then mechanically, if you think about it, you as a reader, if you were reading a written sentence that said Sally has whatever, 3 apples and 5 bananas, whatever, you can go back and look at the 3 and the 5 and the 2, and you can say the sum is 10.
right.
Okay. The LLM is not allowed to rewind and go back to the 3. So it really has to,
Well,
at the time that that token appears, um, it has to, well, okay.
so that was
It
my
has
that
to,
was going to be my second comment because it can go back and read the three. That's what attention can do. So the language models are trained to predict just next token based on what you have. There isn't kind of a process. Oh, let me go back and look at this number, that number, et cetera. So I'm wondering if these uh, examples are these attention, if it changes, if a language model is trained to be a reasoning model as opposed to just a immediate prediction. Like, does it
Yeah.
make
So
space for doing like you said, math, long addition, right? I don't need a
yeah,
lot of rules if I can take a few steps to do it.
yeah. Let me restate um, what I was saying in a little bit of a hand wavy way. But like, if you wanted just to grab the three from a few tokens ago, you're right. You could do that. But let's say it was something that had a little bit more multi-hop reasoning.
Yeah,
You know, like it was the the prefix, you know, octo or whatever, which in your brain you can say, oh, that's the Greek prefix for eight, and I want to grab that eight
hmm
and pull that into the current token position. You theoretically could pull octo, and then you could calculate that that is the Greek prefix for eight in your current token position. But remember, you only have so many layers
right.
in your current token position, so you would be much better off at that current token position where you see octo, turning it into an eight and leaving that eight in layer 12 on the residual stream so that, to your point, attention can go and grab it, but it doesn't have to also do the work of converting
Yeah,
octodate, right? So it's the more things that you can do at the time of that token. And so this, I find, one of the fascinating things that this on the biology is exposing is how much information do you put on the residual stream for possible future use, and
right,
how much do you just commit to predicting your next token?
right.
You know what I mean? Because at the time that you say calculate, see the hover, calculate 36 plus, right? Like, okay, it says calculate. You know you're going to do a calculation, but at the time that it sees 36, it hasn't seen the plus. It doesn't know if it's going to be plus, minus, multiply, square
Yeah,
root, whatever, and it's throwing all this information on the residual stream when really it needs to also expend a bunch of its energy to see, is the next token going to be plus or minus or the English word plus or a space, like, so it has to constantly be uh, 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 I don't know, but balancing that trade-off between how much compute do I expend for my immediate next token, and how much do I just, like a squirrel, pack away all of these things for my future self a few tokens later. I'll be so thankful that you packed that away so that I can grab that and use it,
right.
you know? And if you recall, we were talking about doing, a bunch of experiments on miniature LLMs, and one of them had to do with like the residual stream, and this is where I think that giving the residual stream more room to pack things away could hypothetically improve reasoning and other kinds of tasks, um, because now it just has more uh, space to pack stuff away. And so you could do things in a way where you have certain things that you're allowed to write to, but you don't necessarily read from. If you read from them, that increases the size of your parameters, your weight matrices.
hmm
Okay, right. So if you say in certain places I limit the ability to write, in certain places I limit the ability to read, then you're not
Yeah,
blowing up your attention matrix. Because otherwise
yeah,
you'd say, well, you don't need this special thing. Just double the size of the residual stream from 4,000 to
right,
8,000, and then double it again to 16. But
right.
that makes your model that much bigger, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, if you did it cleverly, where you said in certain places I won't let you read from it, then your parameter count doesn't go up. But you have to let attention sort of read from it, right? Maybe the MLPs don't read from it, but attention can read from it, and thereby, or you alternate layers, even numbered layers, read from this part of the residual stream, odd numbered layers read from
Or
that.
yeah, I can imagine it being useful for them to be actually completely separate spaces. Like they don't That's one of the ones I've wondered about is computation. I know that with through superposition, if you double the size of the residual stream, right, you can represent more, right? But
Way more.
computationally, do you get to represent more, but each individual concept is more expensive to compute because it's bigger,
Yes.
right? So like, does everything need to be maximum dimension,
Right.
or can I have some things that are more common that are lower dimension
Yep.
kind of thing?
Exactly. All right. We're sort of on a tangent, but all
Yeah,
right. So
I'm
we're out
sorry.
of time. Um, but I just wanted to quickly highlight. Yeah. So they show that how some of these features show up in other kinds of sentences, not just calculations. So pretty cool. So we can keep reading. There's additional sections. Let me just flip over to the slides again. Um, so these other examples, one was medical diagnoses. Okay. So just like in the first example, we talked about the capital of the state that contains Dallas, the word Texas never appears in that sentence, yet you clearly see the concept Texas internal to the model. They talked about a bunch of symptoms, and the concept, the direction for preeclampsia, appears in the internals of the model, even though the word was never used. And ultimately, they asked it, uh, what symptoms should you as a doctor ask the patient about that they haven't yet talked about? And then the Claude haiku model was able to correctly say, you should ask about this feature because this is the most common feature of preeclampsia that the patient hadn't yet mentioned they already had. They did some things looking at a certain kind of hallucinations where they basically said, um, made up name, not a real person, is famous for playing the sport of. And you're really sort of like torturing the LLM because it wants to say an answer, but the person doesn't exist. So any answer it gives is basically wrong. Um, and so they showed particular pathways. Well, sorry. So for that, it says like basketball or something, and it's just wrong. Okay. Um, but then the actual haiku model that they released was fine tuned to try to fight these hallucinations. So then they looked at how that one was wired, and you see a specific circuit that says, here's a name, and I don't know who this is. There's like actually a like proper noun that I don't know what this is feature. And so um, uh, when that feature is prominent, it changes the completion to be, I'm not really sure. I've never heard of this guy instead of basketball or baseball or whatever. Um, so that was the hallucination section. Similar kind of a concept for refusals. They did this thing where they came up with a made up acronym, babies over something something, and if you look at the first initials, it's BOMB. Okay. And so they're like, hey, if you did an acronym of this thing, what does that spell? And tell me how to make one. And so this is a jailbreak that has successfully worked against a lot of LLMs. And the super short version is what they found is that all of the energy of the LLM was used to compute what are all these initial letters and then combine them together. And so it's only by the time you get to like the fourth to last layer that it's like BOMB, what token should I use for that? And it outputs, bomb, right? So at this point, it has no idea semantically what it just said. So it's not going to not say it because it doesn't even know that that's the meaning of the word bomb. It's right. It's like this close to got a gun pointed to its head. You got to predict the next token now, and so it finally just blurts out bomb. And then they show that what happens is when that then becomes the input for the next token prediction, what ends up in that particular sentence is the training to complete sentences faithfully overrides. There's a small signal that says you're not supposed to be talking about this, and but that signal doesn't win. It gets drowned out by you should complete sentences in a grammatical way. And there was a paper I read a little while ago where they fine-tuned the models not only to say, hey, I'm not willing to talk about bombs or whatever, but they also fine-tuned it where they would have that string appear in the middle of a sentence. So you'd be like, well, one common chemical combination. Oh, I should not be talking about this. Okay. And I think it would be interesting to see the experiment repeated on the model is fine-tuned that way, because then that model probably would, because it was fine-tuned to be able to ignore its grammatical rules and just at any point blurt out a refusal, mid-sentence, mid-whatever, mid-thought, mid-anything. And this example showed specifically that wiring mechanism. And so what happened is it would say like, hey, combine this chemical and that chemical, period. And then the next sentence was something like, but actually, I'm not going to talk about this anymore because this is a subject that's taboo. Okay, so it waited until it got to a period and then it could like insert its refusal. So I think you could just fine tune it to insert refusals anywhere midstream, and it would probably work better. Oh, sorry. Actually, that was this next one, jailbreak.
Yeah.
Babies outlive mustard block. Okay. So we're way over time, but we're not going to go another session. So I'm just going to very, very briefly say there are limitations here. One thing you can see is, as I mentioned, that they tried to write prompts that kind of boiled down to a single token answer, a single what they called like a crux token of the calculation, the thought process or whatever. And so this isn't really answering more complex, bigger things. How does it do a well-formed chapter that contains many paragraphs, right? It's not answering any questions like that. It's really just answering much shorter, simpler things. It doesn't really do well with super long prompts or long internal reasoning chains. They didn't give it any sort of very unexpected kind of prompts. The prompts were sort of very natural language expected things. What's the capital of? So if you did things where you obfuscated stuff with whatever pig Latin or wrote whatever 64, it really doesn't answer any of the questions of why the model does not do something, because that linear model I talked about, you see all the contributions of features, and there's this known concept that there are suppression circuits. I don't know what else to call it. Okay, I'd say don't do something, and some of it seems to be as simple as if you do scratch work in the middle layers, some of that needs to be suppressed so that the next token prediction only depends on what you want it to depend on, not any of this other intermediate noise stuff that might be sitting on the residual stream. So they don't do that. And then they had this one particular anomaly that with this technique, if the next token prediction was a word that actually appeared earlier in the string, it somehow causes their whole calculations to go haywire. And they get divided by zeros or something like that, and it just doesn't work at all. So these are some of the limitations, and then you can see like specifically it's because of the way they did the replacement model, and that they're not explaining attention at all. The attention's being used faithfully, but not how that attention pattern came about, and some of these other things. But overall, I found it to have some really, really novel, nice explanations. If somebody said for that very first example that the LLM, when you ask it the capital of the state that contains Dallas, just knows because it was trained on trillions of tokens that Dallas is in the same state as Austin, I think that their work very clearly disproves that that's all it did. It very clearly hopped to the concept Texas. And not only did it hop to the concept Texas, but in that one location where Texas appears, if you change it to California, you get Sacramento with 95% confidence.
Right.
And so this is not just something that um, this what I call the stochastic parrot argument, where it's seen so many examples that it can just immediately leap to the answer. It's sort of like if you gave it a verse from the Bible and you gave it the beginning of it, it can probably complete that just through rote memorization. I don't think there's any reasoning that happens there. It's just well enough memorized that I think they gave enough examples to show not everything going on is just memorization. There is some clear multi-step. Now, that's still memorization. That's still a statistical pattern, but it's a multi-step statistical pattern. It is not just a one-hop memorization pattern. So that would be one of my strongest arguments for what they have. They have well defended. All right, we'll end here. And then this is just all the different Anthropic papers. You can, if I go back to here, in the if you look here in the article, it says the transformer circuits thread. And if you click on this, then you can see all the articles, including their smaller updates. But the big articles are the one that have the background color highlighting them. So as you scroll through, you'll see periodically there's bigger articles. And I encourage people, go ahead and take a look at the graphs, go ahead and take a look at the articles in more detail. But hopefully this gives you a good roadmap, good framework for understanding if some of the concepts were a little bit intimidating.
Hey, Ted, how accessible is all of this? I don't know kind of how much computation would take place, but if you wanted to go give it a new prompt and see what it looks like, is there a website that you can go to and do that?
I
Or
don't think
is it
you
more
can go to
involved
a
than that?
website, but they do want researchers, to use or improve upon the techniques that they have, right? So they have this statement here. I don't know if you can see it. My
Yeah.
screen's kind of small. Um, the rough compute requirements to train their transcoder. So on a 2 billion gemma model, 2 billion parameter gemma model with only 2 million sparse features, which is kind of low, okay, on a corpus of 1 billion tokens would require this 10 to the 20th training flops. And that's roughly 200 hours on an H100, which is really not that much, right? So if you had a thingamabobber that's 8 of them, then that thing would take you like a day and a half
Mm-hmm.
on one 8 node, computer. The
But
9 billion,
that's you
the
don't do that for every experiment. You just do that once, right? For the
you just do
model.
that once, right?
Yeah.
Right. The 9 billion gemma model, if you wanted a 5 million sparse transcoder with 3 billion tokens, now you're talking about 3,800 hours. And so this is going to be roughly 20 days, I think, if you have 8 H100s. Unfortunately, because one of their principles is that they are keeping the exact details of the Claude models under wraps so that hackers, whatever, can't do, sort of white box attacks knowing exactly what they're trying to attack. It means that the core research that they did on Haiku, they're not going to release that. Because that would then expose the Haiku model itself. So unfortunately, the CLT that they already trained, I don't think they have a problem with sharing that, but they're not going to share it because it was Claude. If you were like, whatever, the world's foremost NLP researcher at Stanford, yeah, maybe they'll actually like make you sign something that says you won't share it with anybody else and they'll give you a copy of their CLT, but they're not just going to give it to people like you.
And they don't have a hosted service for it.
Not currently. I don't know if you're familiar with uh, and if I don't know if I can find this. Uh, so the National Deep Inference Fabric is a a compute resource meant for people to be able to play around uh, and do LLM research because it tends to be kind of compute heavy. Um, and so, good place to go is if you look at the NN site library. So this is the GitHub link. Oh, this is the web page for it, and then I think this is going to take us to. But anyway, so this is a library that allows you to do a number of different kinds of experiments. I don't know that they've yet implement. So like the sparse autoencoders and stuff, that's all implemented here. And when they do those experiments where like you subtract 2 times Texas and you add 5 times California, that you can do using the NN site package. But we might need to wait for a newer release to fully support the CLT stuff. I'm sure they're working on it, but I just don't know if it's available yet. So let's see here. Yeah, not sure, but so there is some of this kind of support, you know, um, uh, but yeah, it's not quite to the point where it's super easy for anybody to reproduce, do stuff.
Okay.
So what would be nice is it doesn't have to be you. As soon as anybody has said, "Hey, I trained a CLT that has 20 million sparse features, right, on each layer for Llama 3.2, however many, 3 billion or whatever the size is, right? Now that's been trained once. Now all of us get to use it forever and ever without ever having to train it. And then just computing these graphs, you know, this is very, very fast once you already have the pre-trained CLT.
Yeah, that's kind of more where I was thinking is, could I get that graph? If I give you a prompt, could I get that graph?
Yes, yes. So once you have the CLT, once somebody has done it and made it available for a public model like Llama, not Claude, then it's super fast. They have a section in here where they talk about it, but I didn't actually understand all the math. Where is it? The calculations. I'm not.
Well,
Maybe
we're running
somewhere
long.
around here. Yeah.
The
But
answer
anyway,
is that,
you do like a pass and you get all the gradients, and then there's some very, very quick calculations you can do on the gradients that then give you the weights of all of these edges.
yeah. Okay.
So
Cool.
Very cool.
it's somewhere in here they talk about, you know, it's it's very fast. That's the good news. But remember, you get the weights between all the nodes, but you still need to hand label what the nodes mean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other part of that is if you had a community effort to label all the weights you.
Yes, that's right. Once, in theory, if this is a Llama 3.2,
Right.
CLT, then as soon as somebody says layer 4, node 1 is small. Layer 4, node 2 is things related to Paris. Eventually, yeah, you'll have them all.
Here's an interesting one. I wonder if you could get a language model to label the nodes.
Yeah, I think you could get it to do a good chunk of the work.
Yeah.
The input nodes are going to be very clear. The output nodes are going to be very clear. The in-between ones, I had a little trouble figuring out how to reason out the patterns of when they were firing. But
Or even
yes, that's
the labels
probably
they had were right.
yeah. It would be expensive in terms of you know if I needed to do 40 million LLM inferences each on roughly 50 sentences.
Yeah.
Won't be cheap, but it's not astronomical.